This is lesson 70. I had trouble with 69. I'll do it next week. So sorry about that. And we'll be looking at lesson 70 tonight. We're looking at Proverbs, not necessarily the book of Proverbs, although it is a book containing Proverbs, but we're looking at the figure of speech called Proverbs. And there's several different words that in the various translations of the Bible that are translated proverb or proverbs plural. And we're going to consider these words tonight in this outline and in this study tonight. The scriptures contain a number of proverbs besides those in the book of Proverbs. Of course, it's full of proverbs of various sorts. We'll be looking at some of those. A proverb, and this is a poet who wrote this, okay, a proverb is a large amount of wisdom wrapped up in the fewest words. That's pretty good a way of saying it. And so I thought that would be a good definition to put in. And Dungan's Hermeneutics, which is a good hermeneutics book, it's kind of elementary, but it's good for an elementary study of proverbs, of hermeneutics, that is. A proverb then may be regarded as a short, pithy sentence containing a complete and valuable thought. That's another pretty good definition. I like that. Hermeneutics by Dungan is written, the book was written over 100 years ago, I believe, probably back about in the 18th century, I guess, in the 1900s, somewhere late in the 18th century. Parabole, that's a Greek word, parabole, and you can hear the word parable in it, if you will, and it's the same word translated parable. So the same word translated parable is sometimes translated proverb in the King James and maybe perhaps the American Standard Translation as well. The 1901 American Standard Translation, I think the rule of translation was it had to agree with the King James. They couldn't change the King James wording unless they had a 2/3 majority vote of the translators to change it. And if it was somewhere around a 50-50 vote, they would footnote it. I think that's pretty well what you follow. So a footnote in the American Standard, I think, means half or more, 1 or 2, but not 2/3. That's my understanding. And I could be wrong on that, but that's my understanding. So if you have a 1901 American Standard, that's probably pretty well what it means, if you look at it. It's a placing of one thing by the side of another, juxtaposition as of ships in battle. And so two ships get side by side, this particularly in early times, and they would get side by side one another. In the World War II, the Battle of Coral Sea was the first times that two fleets didn't see one another. And it was all with airplanes. Aircraft carriers were attacking with their airplanes. But before that, the ships would have to see one another and shoot their guns. Or in the days of the Bible times, ships would get next to one another and they'd board the ship and launch fire over into the stuff that was running stuff over into the ship because the ships were running and it burned. So side by side of another. So what you're doing is parabole. If you look at the word parabole up here, I'll put my mouse over it up here, move it around. And the first 4 letters are the word for beside in Greek. It's preposition para, beside. And para is a prefix in English. And quite a few words have it. Paramedic and so forth. Paralegal. And bole is something thrown. So basically, parabole is when you throw two things side by side to compare them. That's basically what it means. So it's comparing one thing with another, a likeness or a similitude. There, page 479. That's it, his definition. And the paroimia, and it's from para, beside, as I said. aside from, and oimos, away. So this is more like a road. Hodos is also a road, so it's a different word. Well, you have the words road and way and trail and so forth. These are a little bit different words in English. So Greek has different words. And so we have a almost way, saying out of the usual course or deviating from a usual manner of speaking. So what you're doing is you're doing something, but it's kind of deviating out of the usual manner of saying something. That's what that means. That's that word that's on page 490 in Thayer's lexicon. Okay? And mashal, that's the Hebrew word, mashal. Remember, Hebrew reads from right to left. Mim, Sham, Lamed, Shin, and Lamed. And so mashal, Hebrew doesn't write the vowels, so you have to insert the vowels. And that always gave me trouble trying to figure out what word it was, which vowels went with it. Similitude, a parable, a sententious saying. Sometimes you got to look some of these words up in their definitions, such as consistent, ingenious comparison of two things or opinions. So you're comparing things to one another, pretty much like the word parable. So similitude or parable is translated parable in the Old Testament. Gesenius is the Hebrew lexicon. And we have an update of that. And it's another lexicon with Gesenius in it, a later one. But we have that reference some places about notes. Proverbs are, by their very nature, generalizations. Now, keep this in mind. This is a very important point because when you make a proverb, it's a generalization. And which are usually or generally true, although there may be exceptions. Keep that in mind. They're generally true, but there may be exceptions to it. And so we see a general truth, but it might be exceptions. Solomon sets forth three attributes of Proverbs. In Proverbs, in Ecclesiastes 12:11, right toward the end of the book, he says the words of the wise are as goads. Now, a goad was a sharp-pointed thing that would prick an animal with to make it proceed ahead like an oxen to make it continue pulling a plow or pulling something. And there's nails well fastened, so like a nail fastens things to things. So you drive a nail in and it fastens things together. And so here the words of the wise are as goads and as nails well fastened are the words of the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. So they're like goads or nails. They make sharp points, get to the point and fasten the point down. Let's look at this right here, this verse. We're going to look at it here. The words of the wise are like goads. They get to the point quickly. Probably that's what it probably meant. They make a point very sharply as well, like a goad does. And like nails, they're firmly fixed. They're easy to remember. So a proverb can be very easy to remember. The people did not generally have Bibles like we have. I don't know how many copies of the Bible I have in my house. I'm looking, as I'm sitting right now teaching this class, looking over my bookshelf. I got a whole two shelves full of different translations of the Bible, and two short shelves. 1, 2, 3, 4. About 40 different translations that I have. And some of them are Greek and Hebrew, but most of them are English. Well, only a couple of them are Greek and Hebrew. The Hebrew is on a different shelf. Okay, and so I got the Hebrew on a different shelf. So I got a couple of copies of the Greek New Testament on these shelves. So, but out of the 40, probably 2 or maybe 3 of them are Greek. The rest of them are English. So right here, I have just a whole bunch of Bibles. I don't have to remember everything because I can open my Bible up and read it. I have an electronic copy of the Bible on my computers. All my computers have them. I have a Kindle reader, which I have three different translations in the Greek and the New Testament on my Kindle reader that I take with me sometimes when I go places. So yes, it's one of those things I get. Uh, I have so many sources to access the Bible, and it's almost ridiculous, I guess. I just have all the different translations. I can compare the translations. I do this if it's Greek New Testament, I've translated. If it's a troublesome passage, I translate to see what the Greek says, because sometimes the Greek makes it clearer and it's really clarifies something, and the English is kind of obscure. But I do that first, and I'm kind of had a year of Hebrews. Hebrews kind of not really real proficient with it. I kind of muddle around with the Hebrew a bit, just a year of it. But I do that, and the people of that time didn't even have one copy. That's my point. I guess I got off too much. But they didn't even have a single copy. So how are they going to remember these things? God taught them in a way so that people without printed copies of the Bible, which were very expensive, because printing materials, once you printed, were very expensive materials, and the copying of it, taking a scribe, they didn't have printing presses like we have. And so they very easily, it might take several months to get maybe even half a year to get a full copy of the Old Testament. Several weeks for a scribe to copy, at least maybe several months. So the Lord made a lot of these principles, made them easy to remember by Proverbs and by other ways of wording it. Solomon sets forth that Proverbs set forth a truth and make it appear more beautiful. Again, this is what I call a memory hook. You can attach your memory to it. And I remember when I was studying electronics and so forth, there are various memory hooks to remember certain things in your system. We had memory hooks, little ways, rhymes to make things, help us to remember things. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and network of silver. So can you imagine this? This is like a lattice work, I think, the way they're viewing it. You have apples of gold, and you have a network of silver. So gold and silver, and you can see it now. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that. They're majestic as well. Hatred stirs up strifes, but love covers all transgression. Now notice the contrast. There's a sharp contrast here. Hatred and love are basically opposites. You don't love someone if you hate them. And so love covers all transgressions, and hatred stirs up strifes. Now, hatred causes strife to occur, because if I'm working off hatred, I will stir up strifes. But if I love, I'll cover transgression. Now, covering transgressions needs to be studied as the Bible defines the term, but basically covering transgression, when you study it more fully, you convert the person, you get them in line with God's will. So that's what happens. Transgressions are covered. Not that you ignore them, and that's something that needs to be studied more fully. We're not going to look at it any further tonight. But in James and Peter's writing in the New Testament, love covers a multitude of sins, and then love converts her. So covering of sin is conversion covers sin as well. Hatred therefore stirs strife, and love covers. Now let's look at some proverbial sentences. Now, these proverbs may become part of a sentence, but are not the complete sentence. So they're proverbial phrases in sentences that will help us to study the book of Proverbs. A proverb about Nimrod is an entire sentence in Genesis 10:9. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, before Jehovah or Yahweh. Wherefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Jehovah, before the Lord. Before King James probably says Lord. So here now, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Jehovah. So the proverb about Nimrod, it's an entire sentence. And now, the next slide is of an Assyrian king fighting a lion while hunting. So we're going to see this, and Nimrod is from that area of the world. Nimrod is a mighty hunter. You can see him. And if you look at the relief carvings, this is a carving in the side of a rock, and you get half of the image, and it's carved in. It's called a relief carving. And here, this man, this king, is bigger than a lion, and the lion's on his hind feet. He's grabbing him by the beard, and he's fighting off the lion. If you notice these carvings that they have here, the king is always taller than everybody else. That's he's got to be the big guy, and so he's always carved that way. They were small, and his enemies are smaller than him if he's conquering them. So here he's fighting the lion. He's a mighty hunter. This may even be Nimrod. Okay. The proverb about Saul is an entire sentence now. And one of the same place answered and said, and who is their father? Therefore it became a proverb, is Saul also among the prophets? So Saul prophesied. Now you say, well, Saul really did some bad things. Yes, he did. Being a prophet doesn't guarantee that you're going to always do what's right. A prophet had to also yield himself to God's will, even like he was telling other people to do. So that's important that he had to do that. And Saul had a problem with it. Back in the book of Numbers, about the 20th chapter, we have another man who was a prophet named Balaam. And he went astray, but he was truly a prophet, I believe. So prophets could go astray. We see certain men, and even in the early church, some prophets could have gone astray. Judas Iscariot was an apostle under the limited commission, was an apostle, and he went astray, certainly. So being guided miraculously didn't mean that you were infallibly forced to do what you were teaching. And so Saul, is he also among the prophets? That's a proverb. It's a question, really. And John 4:37 is an entire sentence. For him is the saying true, one soweth, another reapeth. All right? So that's a proverb, one soweth, another reapeth. I sent you to reap that when you have not labored, others have labored, and you're entered into their labor. I grew up on a farm, and we would plant a crop, and then you would harvest the crop later. And I planted crops that I didn't harvest. Somebody else harvested them. And so that occurs. And so here, he's speaking to his disciples here about this. One soweth, another reapeth. So who had been sowing? Well, I can go back in this context and see that John the Baptist had been sowing seed. And of course, John now finally is murdered by Herod, and at the instigation of Herod's wife through her daughter, and he was murdered. So he is not around later to reap. He does some reaping by baptizing people, I believe, as well. So he's probably doing both. But some of those he taught them become disciples of Christ. I sent you to reap that where you have not labored. Others have labored, and ye are entered into that labor. The Jews that were being reaped, some of the labor of teaching them had fallen upon the Old Testament prophets who wrote the 39 Old Testament books. So the labor that they bestowed is still bearing fruit. I think that the fruit of Isaiah's work is still going on. I just picked Isaiah, but the other prophets as well. But their work is still going on. It's their labor is still, people are still studying those books and learning from them and being guided in the truth. So yes, these men have labored, others have labored, and you're entered into their labor. So I've seen men hold gospel meetings, and people would come to the gospel meeting, and later somebody obeys the gospel. You follow up the people that are interested in Bible studies, and they listen, and finally you baptize them. Well, who knows? Only God knows what influence triggered them to obey. But was it the beginning of the man that preached in the gospel meeting? Perhaps. And but God knows, and if we're faithful, God's going to reward us because He knows the influences. So again, you've entered into others' labor, and you've entered into their labor. That could happen. The proverb of 2 Peter 2:22 is an entire sentence. It has happened unto them. Go to the true proverb. Now here's the sentence. Dog turned into its own vomit again, and the sow that had washed to wallowing in the mire. So right here, this is someone, child of God, turning back into the world, going back into the world. It's like a dog eating its own vomit. I preached on this passage one time about how the people could fall away and how that God viewed it. God views us turning back to the sins that we committed before we became Christians, before we became children of God. He views like we're eating our own vomit. Now that's pretty gross, but dogs do that. In fact, a male and a female dog with that puppies, the dogs of the coyotes and wolves, for example, they'll go out and they'll eat an animal, and what they can carry, they'll carry back in their mouth. But they may actually eat a bunch of an animal and carry back what they can. They'll eat what they can and carry back in their mouth what they can carry for their young ones. Then the young ones will eat what they bring in their mouth, and then they'll lick the mother or the father, the male or female there, and then they'll lick them on the lips, and they'll vomit. Then the babies will eat that vomit. And so that happens. It's kind of gross, isn't it? So that's how God views it. God views our returning to the sinful life after we become Christians, children of God. He views it like we're eating our own vomit again. That's pretty gross. That's a vivid description of turning back, or a sow that had washed to wallowing in the mire. And so here, a sow, you wash her, and she immediately goes back out in the mud. Why? Because they don't have sweat glands. It cools their body. They do that to cool themselves. But it's that way, they're dirty again. Now, some of our religious neighbors say, well, a dog and a sow are clean animals. So they never were Christians. But in the context, he's talking about Christians or children of God who went back into the world. Now, I'm convinced, and I believe I developed this in one of the appendixes of my Logic and Debate for Christians book, that a Christian is a faithful child of God. So those children of God who go back into sin, leaving the church, they're still children of God. They always will be, but they're not Christians any longer. So I believe there's a difference. And I believe I'm satisfied that I prove this logically in that book. But I'm not going to go into it right now. So they claim that the dog was sour and unclean, so they never were children of God. But the context shows he's talking about children of God that went back into the world. And of course, this is the quote of Proverbs 26:11. Paul's proverb, Proverbs 26:11. If you go back and study it, we don't have it on the screen here, but it's talking about children of Israel. These are children of God. They were children of God once they're born of Jewish parents. They had to be taught to know God, and they didn't. So when they turned back, that's figure of speech there, of course. Paul's proverb in 1 Corinthians 5:6 is an entire sentence. your drawing is not good. And here's your proverb, know you not that a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. So it doesn't take much leaven to leaven the whole lump. So they put a little leaven in a lump of dough and knead it, squish it around, called kneading it. K-N-E-A-D, kneading it. And then what happens is that leaven spreads. It's yeast. And if the temperature is right, it'll just grow like crazy. The yeast multiplies rapidly. And so we'll get the leavening of the whole lump. The whole lump will be leavened, the whole lump of dough. And this is looking at sin. And the sin in the church can leaven the church. It can spread in the church. So when that happens and the church gets infected with it, we have troubles. These proverbs may become part of the sentence, but are not the complete sentence. The fear of the Lord, fear of Jehovah, fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. So in order to learn, we must have a reverence for God. And this is a reverential fear, is what it is. So he says here, that's the beginning of knowledge. I'm not going to learn of anything from the Bible unless I respect the Bible, unless I revere it as God's very word. Once I do that, I'll approach the Bible in a different way when I study it. Skeptics, atheists, agnostics, they approach the Bible as, with a wrong view. And when they do, they'll twist it and wrest it to their own destruction, as Peter said, 2 Peter 3. So the fear of the Lord, the fear of Jehovah Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. But notice the word but, that's the contrast. So here's the opposite of it. The foolish despise wisdom and instruction. So who is it that doesn't fear the Lord? It's the foolish. And the beginning of wisdom is wisdom and instruction, the beginning of knowledge. So the beginning of wisdom begins to make me wise, instruct me as to how to live, how to conduct myself. That's what these scriptures are all about. But I won't view that as instruction on how to live if I don't realize it's from God and that it is God's intended way of my conducting myself. So I have to begin with the right attitude toward the scriptures in order to truly be instructed. Jeremiah 13:23 says here, can the Ethiopian change his skin? Well, we can't change our skin color. Or the leopard his spots. Oh, that's a genetic thing, say. Then may ye also do good that are accustomed to do evil. And as long as we are accustomed to do evil, we don't do good. So we have to change ourselves. The Ethiopian can't change his skin, the leopard can't change his spot. A person who's accustomed to evil, they make their whole life a life about doing evil, they won't do good. They'll do evil. As long as one is accustomed to do evil, he will not do good. He must change our hearts to please God. So we can change, but we have to cease to be accustomed to do evil in order to please God. Jesus used a series of proverbial phrases on the Sermon on the Mount. Now, this Sermon on the Mount is the 5th, 6th, and 7th chapters of Matthew. It's also, I believe, in the book of Luke as well. You have the salt of the earth. Now, here's a proverb, but if the salt has lost its savor, well, it shall be salted. It is henceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and trodden under foot of men. Now, let's look here. Salt can lose its savor. Why? Because salt is a combination of two chemicals, two elements, sodium and chloride, sodium and chlorine, actually. So sodium chloride is the name of salt. That is, we're talking about table salt that you eat. Now, in chemistry, the word salt has a different meaning. What we call table salt that we put on our food is salt. And that's what he's talking about here, that salt. There's another salt that most people are aware of, Epsom salt. So it's the different compound of different elements than sodium and chlorine. right here, the salt has lost its savor. What happens? If some certain elements get mixed in with the salt, it breaks the sodium chlorine down and forms another element, another compound is what it forms, chemical compound. So whereas shall it be salted if it's lost its savor, it's worth good for nothing, but be cast out, trodden under foot of man. So you can't mix the Bible and you can't mix the truth of the living right with error. Because when you mix the error in with it, it corrupts it. Only the pure word of God, living by that, is the only way that will have its right savor. So it's good for nothing. What's it good for? You put on the street. So if that's what it's good for. And he goes on to the next verse, you're the light of the world. So a city set on a hill cannot be hid. God put Christians where the world can see us, but he wants us to be a light to the world. If we're not living properly, we're hiding that light, or we're showing the wrong thing, or the light of the world, the city set on the hill. So the church and God's people have been set up and elevated for the world to see. So that's what he's telling us. You can't, the city set on the hill cannot be hid. And God intends that people look at us and see our lives. He intends for our lives to be examples to draw attract them to Christianity, to the church. Why? Because if we live right, the people of the world can see a difference between us and people of the world. And they're attracted to it. Good people will want that. That's what they'll want. They demand a lot of lamp put under the bushel. Now, a bushel is just a basket. And it's a basket that you carry grain or something else in. They would go to the market and buy wheat or grain. It wasn't ground up in flour like we buy ours ground up in flour. They had whole grain wheat. Then they would grind enough to make their meal and leave the rest of it stored. And he says, so it's men light a lamp and put it under the bushel. Then they don't cover it up with something. They put it on a stand, lampstand, so it can shine it all over the house. So God, we're like a lamp that God wants to use, and he's going to put us on a stand, put us up to the world to see. I've heard some people say, well, I don't like the people who are always looking at me. Well, that's what God intended. If we live right, our lives can attract the attention of people. Not being hypocritical, not being arrogant, not being smug, but in our love and kindness, we can draw people's attention to the church, to God's kingdom. The proverb of Jesus in Acts 20:35 is a proverbial phrase. This is a proverb that's not found anywhere else. It's the Apostle Paul states it. In all things, I gave you an example that so laboring ought to help the weak. So Jesus gave an example. Well, help the weak. Remember the words of the Lord Jesus that he himself said. So here now is the proverb that Jesus uttered. It's not found anywhere else in the New Testament. So this is evidence of direct revelation from Jesus to Paul, because Paul didn't read it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So he got it directly from Christ. That's evidence of it. So Jesus, he himself, the Lord Jesus, that he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Giving provides more blessings upon the giver than it does upon the recipient. If, of course, this in context has to be giving from the heart, not giving grudgingly or necessity, as we see in 2 Corinthians. So it's important that our heart be right in order to be blessed in our giving. And the one who receives it will be blessed, but it's more blessed. It's a greater blessing. the one who is doing the giving gets a greater blessing than the one who's receiving it. It may be the one receiving it receives a great blessing, but in the act of giving in the proper way, we're going to be blessed even more than they are. So it's a double blessing, one for the giver and one for the recipient. Questions or comments? Let's summarize it now. A proverb then may be regarded as a short, pithy sentence containing complete or valuable thought. We've seen several proverbs here. And some of the attributes of proverbs, they get to the point quickly. They get right to the point quickly. They make the point sharply. They're easy to remember. All right. And again, in times when people didn't have a full copy of the scriptures, they needed to remember what was said. They would listen to the reading of the scriptures, and then they would try their best to remember what was read to them. And the kings were always to have a copy of the scriptures and read them every day. But the common people wouldn't necessarily have copies, but they would put it to memory, and the Proverbs would help them to remember things. Set forth the truth and make it appear more beautiful. The truth is more beautiful. He set forth the truth in a majestic manner, so it's very majestic. And they're either in the form of complete sentences or in short phrases. I'm going to go back. I'm going to look at this one verse here. All right. In this passage here, we can see that, and if we go in the book of Proverbs, we can see this as well. It's more blessed to give than to receive has to be taken in the context of the entire New Testament or the entire Bible, actually. And so what is it saying? If a person gives grudgingly or of necessity, he is not blessed. If a person gives in order, and that's in 2 Corinthians, if a person gives to be seen of men in the Sermon on the Mount, he's not going to be blessed by it. So this has to be taken in the full context of the whole Bible. And so this is not always true because there are limitations based on the scriptures on this, who is going to be blessed, more blessed. One who gives is more blessed if he gives in harmony with the scriptures. He has the right motive, the right attitudes, the right actions. And I can't steal or rob a bank and then give all the money to the church and be blessed with it. Can't do that. I can't steal and defraud my fellow man and give more money to the church and be blessed. That won't happen. So again, that's why this is generally true and not necessarily always true. Are there questions about that now? Okay. Well, stop recording. Okay.